Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of the Hedgehog Business Podcast. Today is a very special episode for me because Kylie was the first ever guest that I had on this show, and she was kind enough to agree to do it when I had obviously no audience, no equipment, no microphone, no lighting. So it was just me in a dark room, and she was still kind enough to sit down with me for about 40 minutes, I think, to just share her knowledge and her experience. And since then, Kylie had just moved to the U.S. from Australia in her moving her operations over here, elevated consulting, and now she's been also extremely active, going from one podcast to one event to another, sharing her knowledge, sharing her story. So I'm very happy to introduce again Kylie as one of our guests. And so I'm going to pass it over to her with a very simple question. How are you doing today?
Oh, great. Thank you so much. It's so nice to reconnect with people that you met at the beginning of a journey or a part of your journey. So it's so nice to reconnect and be back. Thank you. But today's great. Busy.
Yes, busy, busy. And I hope it's a good type of busy for you, right?
It is. I feel probably the same as you that when you create your own company or your own business, even though the busyness is always there as an entrepreneur, you get to do work that typically you really love. So yeah,
hmm
it's always a good busy.
Yeah, and we'll get into that in a little bit because I know part of what you do is helping people be able to reconnect with that sense of purpose and love for what they do and in their lives. But before we kind of go into that, can you tell us how it's been moving your operations here to the US? What are some of the challenges that you've been facing, not just from a go-to-market perspective, but also just cultural challenges, the challenges of having to essentially start over in many ways?
That's such a good question. So we moved the company, my family and I moved here a little over 6 months ago, but we actually
hmm
launched and expanded into the US market about 18 months ago.
hmm
So I was trying to do all those startup remotely from Sydney, Australia, which
hmm
had its challenges because
Yeah.
you're not embedded in the country, in the market, in the
Yeah.
local community. And because our work is all very related to social impact
Yep.
and supporting people to thrive and reach their full
hmm
potential, what I realized very quickly is we have to physically be here. So fast forward 6 months, and that's what we've been doing. But some of the challenges I think would be establishing that new professional network.
Yeah.
You're starting from scratch, and a lot of the work that we do in Australia is with our coaching clients, so individuals typically or groups and teams. But we work a lot with nonprofits, national nonprofits in Australia, and the state and federal governments. That's easy when you're a citizen and you've established your professional profile and
hmm
reputation, right?
Yep.
So moving to a new country, it's things like navigating a new taxation system, compliance as a business owner, regulations. They're really different here. There's
hmm
different layers to the tax system here as well. Um, but I guess they're challenges, but having a really great network of business advisors and business partners like our accountants and all of those advisors, that's taken that off my plate. But the biggest challenge
Mm.
was really establishing that network of and building those partnerships from scratch, getting the brand out there and establishing a new professional profile for myself and the company.
Yeah, and I think it kind of goes in par with the age old saying your network is your net worth, right? Which is I mean
Mhm.
it's a little bit overused in the last few years, but I still think it holds very very much true. And so what are some of the things that you've been doing? Because I know you're very active on social media, and I see you on podcasts and on events all the time. And besides that being very exhausting, probably for you just mentally, right? Has has that enabled you to also kind of expand your network here? And if so, what success have you seen from it?
It's been mind blowing, to be honest. The things that we've been able to be involved in and the
Mm-hmm.
partnerships we've built off the back end of some of the events I've been involved in, whether
Mm-hmm.
that's a keynote, whether it's a podcast,
Mm-hmm.
um, that has very quickly, in the space of a short 6 months,
Yep.
built our network of partners, whether they're nonprofits operating nationally across the US, whether it's legislators. We're doing some work now to advocate for psychological safety and the Psychological Safety Act legislation to be brought in different states now, which is really meaningful work to me. But those events and that, I guess, PR activity has really opened doors for us to have conversations with people about partnerships and work, doing the work that we love doing. So it's been mind-blowing how quickly that's happened.
That's awesome. Yeah, and I mean, right now in the digital era that we are, right? People are able to grow a lot quicker that they
Yeah,
otherwise would because they have access to just such a mass amount of audiences at a time, right?
yeah.
Before we kind of dive into, because I really want to dive into your area of expertise and the things that you do, which I think everybody that's going to be listening to this needs to know about. But before we get into that, I do want to ask you a little bit about the psychological what was it, the Psychological Safety Act.
Mhm.
Can you tell us a little bit more about that and your involvement in that project?
Sure. So, unlike Australia and other countries like the UK, the US has no legislation currently that protects workers from psychological abuse in the workplace.
I see.
That's scary. So there's
Yeah.
legislation that protects certain groups of people from discrimination and harassment, but there's no legislation currently in any US state. We're getting close in Massachusetts, and the next will be states like Rhode Island, and I guess DC is not a state, but it's certainly um, it's a big part of the states and what we want to do. But there's no Psychological Safety Act that protects people or workers from psychological abuse and
Mm-hmm.
from acquiring psychological injuries or sustaining psychological injuries in the workplace. So, what we know from our research and our practices as psychotherapists, we know that the incidence of psychological injuries being sustained in workplaces globally is
Mm-hmm.
escalating, it's skyrocketing at the moment. And in countries like the US, where there's no legislation to hold employers accountable for
Mm-hmm.
bullying, harassment, and things like that,
Mm-hmm.
what we're seeing is this huge increase in employees' psychological injuries. So when it comes to mental health and well-being, employees are really suffering in the workplace at the moment. So we are working with some amazing nonprofits that are operating nationally, some amazing purpose-driven individuals that are like myself and so many others, survivors of psychological abuse that has occurred in the workplace. And we're trying to get it past this legislation and a Psychological Safety Act now.
I'm really glad that you mentioned that because I hadn't heard about that. But I wanna dive a little bit deeper into the psychology of business owners and the
Mhm,
psychology between the relationship of the business owner and the employee.
mhm,
Um, and so I want to start out with obviously, which is one of the things that you're trying to help with with this act, is the mistreatment of employer psychologically to the employee.
mhm,
My estimation that some of that may be rooted in traumatic experiences that the business owner has,
mhm.
or a relationship, maybe an unhealthy relationship with their ego.
Oh, yeah.
Um, that's my observation. Again, I'm not an expert, and that's why I'm really happy that you're here. Where do you think that behavioral pattern in a business owner that treats their employees in that way to the point of psychological abuse, where do you think that behavior comes from?
Or, I mean, the two that you mentioned, absolutely. So it could be a them problem, as we call it, which is
Hmm.
they've got their own deep-rooted trauma. They may have been bullied or harassed themselves in the past, right?
Right.
Bullied people, the bullied often become bullies.
Right.
Um, or I mean, and or it could be, like you said, an unhealthy relationship with their ego.
Hmm.
A complete lack of emotional intelligence is typically what we see as well with leaders
Hmm.
or business owners that treat their employees in such a way that employees are psychologically abused or harmed.
Hmm.
Um, the other thing that we do see, and if you talk to any survivors of psychological abuse, that or those that have sustained psychological injuries in the workplace, a lot of them will tell you their story starts with them being typically long-standing employees that are high performers. So
Interesting.
what we see is that people are typically, high performers are typically targeted either by a leader or by a colleague and then other colleagues, which is a term in the US called mobbing. I've never heard that term until we
I
were
haven't heard
here,
of it either.
which is essentially people piling on and targeting one individual
I
because
see.
either they're a high performer, they might be in the running for a promotion, or they might be receiving compliments, accolades, praise from their leader or upper management. And one person or a number of people notice that, and through their own ego, mere jealousy, or whatever else, negative behaviors that drive that, that's typically the story that we hear time and time again, is that these are high performers. That's what happened to me in the workplace. I was a high performer, one of the highest as an executive, and people are targeted. So whether it's the CEO that's treating people like that because they're afraid to lose their job to an up and coming leader, I'm not sure what particular things drive it, but those are a few that we hear about. But it definitely comes down to leaders or people that have got a real lack of emotional intelligence. I mean, you have to treat other human beings that way.
Of course. That concept is very interesting because, I mean, in Robert Greene's book, The 48 Laws of Power, the first law in that book is never outshine your master. And his explanation for that is because, well, it's twofold. One is that human beings by nature have an intrinsic need to feel superior. And number two, again, going back to the ego question, is because of that need for superiority and importance. The moment that somebody starts to feel that you're better than them at something, that again, that is a fault of their own mind, but that in their own mind diminishes their importance or how they're perceived in an organization. What is your recommendation on that? Because someone like Robert Greene would be, his recommendation might be more on the lines of learn to navigate that. So you can kind of circumvent what is in his view is something that is just innate in human nature. Or I'm very curious to hear your perspective on that.
We still do a lot of work in this space supporting individuals experiencing this in the workplace in Australia. So we don't practice this part of our company here in the US. We do more of the advocacy with the legislation. But what we typically do when we have an individual come to us that is still in a workplace and is experiencing bullying, harassment, discrimination, the first thing that I do and my team do is really assess the mental health of the individual. And that will inform the advice that we give them around next steps. So sometimes, typically what we receive is a phone call saying, Kylie, I've been invited to a meeting by my CEO and, deputy CEO. It doesn't sound good. I don't know what it's about. Should I go? And there's legislation that does protect employees in Australia. So the way we operate is a little different. But that person, if they are nearing what I would call a psychological breakdown, or they are already saying to me, I struggle to get out of bed in the morning, it's impacting my marriage, or I'm recognizing that I'm really angry and I'm lashing out. I sit down and have a really honest conversation with them and say, this is something we can address legally. So you don't have to just quit and leave your job and try and move on. But it's, where are you at mentally as far as fighting this fight? We can go all the way to litigation, but that has its own trauma. That's a traumatic process.
Right.
So for me, when I give advice to individuals that are in that space, it's either you can navigate this and stay in that workplace, but that's not sustainable either. So if you're starting to experience certain things that as a psychotherapist I know are, the red flags of a psychological injury, it's either you need to remove yourself from this workplace swiftly and then take action, whether that's legal action or not, or you can put yourself at further risk of psychological psychological harm and injury by trying to navigate it and remaining in that organisation. It's tricky here in the US because there's no legislation to protect people, and employers do everything they can in these situations to avoid liability and litigation, that it's really difficult for employees to navigate it and fight it. They either remain in the organisation, try and navigate that, and ultimately they leave anyway, because it's, I would say 95% of the time it doesn't improve. If someone's out to get you and you've got a target on your back, that's not going to go away, regardless of how high your emotional intelligence is in trying to navigate it. But it is very difficult for employees here to address it and to resolve it if the employer is trying to avoid liability.
Yeah. And I'm not going to name this employer that I had, but it was a very similar kind of, situation that you're describing where if they had it out for one person, it was no matter what that person did, it was not going to change. Right. And it got to the point that it was like of public humiliations and things like that to just, I mean, I don't even know why. It was like, instead of just getting rid of the person, right? And it's so interesting to me. And so I wanna dive a little bit deeper in terms of like the psychology of the business owner with you, if it's okay. And you can correct me if I'm wrong at in any of this, right? Because obviously you know a lot of this, But my point is, one of the things that I've seen in some successful people, not all of them, is that the same insecurities and traumas are almost fueling some of that that purpose driven, or that it's fueling some of that want for acquisition of status, right? Because they don't want to relive that, and they're kind of running away from it, while also kind of using it as fuel. And then they get to this situation where they are able to amass a lot of this power, but they haven't changed as a human being, because all of their power is rooted in those insecurities, almost functioning as a, like as a fire, almost, right? And I've seen it in a lot of different in a lot of different cases. My question to you is, how often do you come across that type of pattern, and also how does one escape themselves from that so they can also want to be very successful and want to be an entrepreneur, a business owner, but it doesn't necessarily have to be rooted in trauma or in insecurity?
The first part of your question is, unfortunately, I see it a lot more often. In my own situation, that was exactly the type of CEO that I was dealing with. Two, actually, in fact. And the scary thing was that both of them outwardly presented as something very different to what so many of the executives and senior leaders experienced. Absolute psychological abuse, harassment, yelling at people, humiliation. But outwardly, both of those CEOs presented themselves as purpose-driven, doing good in the community. It's very scary that individuals can literally wear two different masks.
Yeah.
And I think that what one in particular did was used the fear that she put into people, so that although everybody that worked in that organization knew the true person, the true identity of that person, that she was an absolute egomaniac, to be really blunt, but people were so scared to speak out, to take action. There was individuals that took legal action eventually, but people were so fearful that of these individuals that they would just resign, or they would go on workers' compensation for their psychological injuries and eventually still be off and never return to that workplace, but never speak about their experience because of fear. So I see a lot of that constantly, both here in the US and in Australia still. And what was the second part of your question, Raphael?
So the second part is, how do you get to a position where you are a business owner, you're very successful, but you're driven by something else that's not, that trauma or insecurity?
Mm. Well, I think when you think about purpose, right, and we
Mm-hmm.
touched on purpose briefly at the beginning, purpose, in my opinion, and through the conversations I have with coaching and consulting clients, are saying, I need my why and I need to find my purpose. You typically, what you see is people that seek their purpose and then genuinely live it in their work. A lot of that's informed by or built out of people's trauma, their experiences, and their want to use their pain and the challenges they've overcome to do good in the world. And that can look really different for different people.
Mm-hmm.
So, and we've all overcome trauma. We've all, felt trauma in our lives, experienced trauma. But it's how we look at, and it comes down to mindset, right? It's how we look at that trauma and how we as individuals heal and evolve, and then use that as the baseline to say, well, I'm going to help people that may be walking a similar path to what I did, or I'm going
Mm-hmm.
to use this experience and this trauma of mine and overcoming adversity in my life to give back in a sense, or to use that as a platform to help other people who might be going through those same challenges now. So, and usually that self-awareness and that work and, that evolving as a human being and individual, they're usually the best leaders too, because they are usually really people driven.
Mm-hmm.
They protect their teams at all costs. They really prioritize their employee well-being, and they're the leaders that see the importance in fostering psychologically safe and inclusive workplaces.
Here's another really strange thing, right? Because I don't want to say that you need to have some sort of challenge to be a successful leader. I don't think, or to be a very successful person. But I also see value in it, in the
Mm-hmm.
sense of, building that resilience, right? So, how do you consolidate those two sides of yourself? One saying, I cannot have too much trauma because it'll probably break me, but I need to have a little bit of it, or at least a little bit of challenge, to give me enough resilience to be able to be a good leader. So
Mm-hmm.
as a person now, as society as a whole, how do we consolidate that in the future generations as well?
Well, I think it's also it's hard to build trust and rapport and relate to people as a leader unless you've had some sort of experiences, overcome challenges,
Mm-hmm.
um, trauma perhaps in your life, so that people can look at you and think, oh, I'm understood by this person.
Right.
Um, we're never going to be a leader that's experienced something that every single member of our team has. I had over 120
Mm-hmm.
staff. Most of them were refugees. I,
Mm-hmm.
I had not experienced, I didn't have a refugee experience, and I hadn't had a migrant experience at that time.
Mm-hmm.
But what I did have was a high degree of emotional intelligence,
Mm-hmm.
and I had family members that had been migrants. And I think it comes down to leaders that, whatever their challenges and traumas experience, we do need that to be resilient, but we also need it to be grateful. I always say to
Mm-hmm.
people, those adults that you meet that have never overcome any adversity or never had any challenges to overcome in their life, they're the adults that are so unfortunate, because they're usually the ones that have never experienced gratitude,
Mm-hmm.
right?
I see what you're saying.
Because you need the storm to have the sun.
Right.
You can't, it's so hard to establish or feel gratitude when you haven't lost something or experienced challenges or adversity. I hope that makes sense, but I think it's the same with resilience. It'd be really difficult to have a leader that would be effective leading a team that had not overcome some challenges, adversity, or trauma in their life, because they're not relatable as a human being,
Right.
you know?
That makes a lot of sense. And I think that kind of reminds me of what Dostoevsky used to say, of one of his critiques of communism, was that if we had a perfect world where nobody suffered, we would find ways
Mm.
to provoke our own suffering, because we almost need that to give our life a little bit more meaning, right? Because we can only understand happiness as a contrast to sadness, or
Yeah.
good as a contrast to evil. now this is a little bit more of like an existential question for you, Kylie, which is obviously this generation, our children, and a lot of the younger generation now, they've probably had the most advantageous life in human history. One could argue that, right? And so, how do we ensure that the next generation has enough resilience and strength, given their privilege in life? Because obviously, they're not going a lot of, there's still a lot of poverty, but the poverty index is rising, is becoming a lot lower. I mean, so how do we teach the next generation of employees and of children to say, yes, you do have a lot of benefits, you do have a lot of a lot of uh, a lot of good things going for you, but you still need to have access to some of these things. How do we navigate that?
I'm going to speak as a mother here and an employer,
Mm-hmm.
but as a mother, my daughter, she'll be 16 in June, she's lived a very privileged life. She's had trauma, when her dad and I divorced and other things, and she remembers those things.
Mm-hmm.
However, she, from a very early age, was very aware of her privilege.
Mm-hmm.
She knows for the whole time that she's been on this planet that mum has worked with people who are disadvantaged, who
Mm-hmm.
are underrepresented. I took her to work with me. She would to our social enterprises and to visit with my refugee clients and their children. She would see the other side of life,
Mm.
essentially. So I think it's, as parents, but also as employers and leaders, it's our job, part of our job, to educate and build awareness amongst young people that, and I used to say to my daughter when we lived in Sydney, we lived on the beach and again, privileged. And I used to
Mm-hmm.
say to her, Sienna, this is not real life. Come with me to work an hour outside of Sydney CBD and you'll see what real life is like.
Mm.
People are struggling. There's families of 12 living in a 2-bedroom apartment. These are people who have newly arrived to Australia that still would prefer this life to the one they've
Mm.
escaped in a war-torn country. So I think it's that balance of, we don't want to traumatize our kids and our employees, but we do have to build that awareness and educate them on, what and it's probably also about building their gratitude too, is that what's going on in the world.
Mm.
um, what are their privileges? Because a lot of kids just think this is life. I know a lot of my daughter's friends, they think they're hard done by, and it's like, oh my goodness, you live a very privileged life. So it is the job of parents at an appropriate age to start exposing their kids to what's going on in the world.
Mm.
And making it relatable. So when Sienna was quite young, I did a lot of work with young girls and young women in Afghanistan with a non-profit there. And I would tell her stories about how it was illegal for girls in that country to even had access to books and an education. And so very quickly she understood that her human rights are a privilege, the fact that they're not being breached every day.
Right.
And it's a lot for a young person to take in. But what's the result of that has been that now I've got a daughter who's driven by her purpose to work in human rights or work as a psychologist to help other people that aren't as privileged as her. So in whatever way is appropriate, I think it's definitely a responsibility of society and parents and leaders and schools to make kids aware and educate them about their own privilege, and make it relatable by showing them the lives of kids of their age, and young people their age.
That's a wonderful response. And I think that, and again, maybe in large part, again, kind of goes back to having exposure, right? For them seeing it, experiencing it, almost kind of reaching that perfect balance, as if any balance was ever perfect, right? Um, so Kylie, now kind of moving on to, the work that you're doing over at Elevated Coaching and Consulting. Can you maybe give us, a brief overview of your approach and what makes you guys very unique? Because I think, more business owners should be working with people like yourself.
So I think that one of the differences between how we operate, particularly as a consulting firm, that might be a bit different to others, is that we adopt a positive psychology approach. So a psychological lens to everything we do, whether it's consulting projects, but certainly to our coaching programs as well. So we have two arms to the business. We have our coaching programs, and that could be our elevated mindset program. It could be our career coaching programs. We do leadership coaching, business coaching, but we also do a lot of work empowering women. So we have an empowering women program as well. And then on the consulting side, like I said, we adopt a psychological lens to all the work that we do, whether it's with a corporate, whether it's with a nonprofit that might be needing some change management expertise, whether it's organisational transformation. But we are more and more doing a lot of work in the diversity, equity, inclusion and psychological safety space, because the leaders and organisations globally are starting, thank goodness, to recognise the importance of having genuinely not only diverse workforces, but inclusive and psychologically safe workplaces for them to be not only, I guess, sustain their success, but to retain talent. So we do a lot of work in that space as well. And so that's some of the work that we do. With our nonprofits, we typically do a lot of program design. So we go in and we partner with our nonprofit partners. We do a lot of grant writing for them. We design programs for them, or co-design programs like pre-employment programs, disability awareness and inclusion programs. And then we typically do the grant writing side. They win the grant funding, and then we usually come back in and they engage us to help with the implementation after they've been successful with the grant, so that they can run the program successfully.
So it's a very 360 kind of scope, from the personal development, psychological, but then also on the consulting piece, right?
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
Awesome. Now, Kylie, I do want to ask you a question, and it's on the topic of inclusion, equity and inclusion. Now, I think this is it's a very controversial in some ways topics, at least here in the U.S. Because we have two, I guess it would be two ways of thinking about it. One would be is the equality of opportunity, and then we have the equality of outcome. So where do you sit on that spectrum between those two sides?
So what we, I guess, advise and what we genuinely believe in is that human beings as a whole, we don't work with one particular group. We look at inclusion of all, everyone, either in access to education, equal access to promotion, learning opportunities, career progression, whatever it looks like. But the way that we look at equality is that every human being in an organisation firstly has a right to feel seen, heard, respected and included. But we do use a framework to make sure that it's not, our approach to diversity, equity, inclusion is not focused on, say, people of colour only, or people living with a disability only, or people from refugee backgrounds. It's everyone needs to be treated as a human being, and there's ways to do that when it comes to equity, access, physical access, access to education, access to career progression, whatever that means in an organisation. There are ways to do that to make sure that every human being, every employee has their voice heard, is included. It takes a little bit of work because there's a lot of things in there like language that need to be considered as well. We often forget that language matters. The words we use in a workplace and the way we say things in a workplace can be either inclusive or really exclusive, borderline offensive to some people. So it's the approach we take is slow everything down, be really mindful before we speak, before we act, think about how accessible things like our meetings are to all employees. So that's where we sit on sort of, that continuum you were talking about, is looking and thinking about human beings rather than groups of people, which typically organisations say, we've got a disability inclusion program, and I say to them, that's wonderful, because that is a group of people within society that need a lot of different support, and they've got unique challenges. What about all of your other staff?
Mm-hmm.
So we don't want to be inclusive of one group, but at the risk of excluding others. So
Right.
it's probably a little bit more holistic, I would say.
And one of the issues that we have, at least culturally here, is, and more recently in the U.S. Around this, is that, well, you have the two extremes of the argument. One saying, well, what percentage of people of every color, race, and background should you hire, right? Or and then the other side essentially saying we should not, that we should do completely away with all of that. What I'm getting from what you're saying is that you're somewhere in kind of in the middle of that, and you're saying it's not about lumping groups of people. It's from more on the identity politics type of perspective. I don't feel that you're coming from that point of view. Now, I feel you're coming from the perspective of the individual differences in everybody in the organization, and enabling a way so that everybody feels part of the pack, almost,
Yes.
right? Is that
Yeah.
kind of what you're saying here?
Absolutely. And it's interesting what you just said about, having diversity and inclusion quotas, essentially.
Mm-hmm.
You need to have 10% of the board, or 50% of the board. I know a lot of Australian companies now have a quota, if you like, of,
Mm-hmm.
or a commitment to having 50% of their board is made up of women, 50% of their leadership team must be
Right.
women. I understand why companies are doing, I think there's multiple reasons why companies and institutions do that, is because they need to report on it. Their shareholders want to see it. Their
I
staff want to
see.
see it. They need to demonstrate their commitment to diversity, equity, inclusion.
Mm-hmm.
However, I would think that if we get to a place, hopefully in the near future, where we don't need to be driven by, we must have 50% of women, it becomes more of a natural inclination to do that naturally without essentially being told to do it.
Mm-hmm.
That's where I'd like to see globally diversity, equity, inclusion go, is that, the right people for the right jobs without any discriminatory lens being applied. That's what we will see, not people, I guess, missing out on career progression opportunities because they're a single working mum, or because of the colour of their skin, or because they might belong to the LGBTQ community.
Mm-hmm.
I would love to see a world where people, find themselves in career progression opportunities or on boards because of the credibility that they bring and the skills and experience that they bring. I think we're a long way from that. I think that's me higher dreaming a little bit there. But I understand both sides of the argument for having those diversity, equity, inclusion targets or commitments, is that people, shareholders and employees, more and more are demanding to see that evidence and that commitment from companies. So companies report on it.
I see. Now, do you think that there are intrinsic psychological differences in terms of preferences between men and women?
When we're hiring, for instance?
No. So, for example, right, like, let's say certain fields in education are, women prefer certain fields a lot more than men, and the
Oh,
other way
yeah.
around, right?
Yeah.
And so, for example, like the liberal arts, I think the vast majority of people that are, going in the liberal arts tend to be women, right? So political science, English, literature, history, etc.
Yeah.
Whereas more on the STEM field, it tends to be more driven. There tends to be more men applying to those sorts of programs. And so some of the arguments that I've seen in terms of like the 50-50 split, right, between men and women, is that, well, men and women have different interests inherently in terms of their psychological makeup. Where do you stand on that?
I agree. They do. Absolutely. But what, I guess, from my experience designing and delivering programs, like we designed a program in Australia for a national nonprofit called Connecting Women to Trades. And we know that globally, women stepping into, being attracted to, and being and staying in trade careers that are typically, I hate to use this terminology, but male dominated, or more male a higher percentage of males, let's say,
Mm-hmm.
operate and work in those STEM and construction and trade careers.
Mm-hmm.
What we find in that program and others in STEM is that women have a burning desire to be an electrical engineer or
Mm-hmm.
work in telecommunications.
Mm-hmm.
But there's, I guess, two parts to it. First, the attraction of women to those trades or those career paths. They're not speaking the language of women to attract the talent. Firstly,
Mm-hmm.
but what we hear, and look, to be fair, when we sit with the women in the Connecting Women to Trades program, a lot of it is the confidence. They're really lacking the confidence to pursue a career
Mm-hmm.
in trades or STEM, whether that's related back to family expectations, societal expectations. A lot of it starts with the woman just saying, "I don't know, I'm really
Mm-hmm.
lacking the confidence." But I think that lack of confidence comes from then when women go into those careers, not all, but the feedback from a lot of women who have gone into trades careers has been the discrimination, bullying,
Mm-hmm.
harassment, and really, really poor um, employee experiences in the workplace
Mm-hmm.
that have made them very swiftly leave those careers.
Mm,
And
I see.
if one woman experiences that, 100 women hear about it, you
Mm.
know?
Yeah, yeah,
And
for sure.
so what we find, particularly in Australia, and we're doing a lot more work over here in the States in connecting women to trades careers and apprenticeships in trades, but it really is dependent on a lot of things. It's working with employers as well as groups of women that are interested in those careers and making sure that the workplaces are genuinely committed to inclusion and psychological safety to welcome women into those workplaces and those careers, but also doing just the same amount of work with the women and the groups of women to empower them to pursue those careers, to build their awareness around the fact that they have rights as workers, and to build their confidence to pursue whatever career path they want to do, using that hashtag that girls can too.
Mm-hmm.
So I
Mm-hmm.
think it's both. It's empowering young women and women to pursue their goals and career aspirations, whether it's in STEM, whether it's in trades, but also making sure that we're doing just as much of that work with industry and employers to make sure that when women go through those apprenticeships or go through that career journey, that when they secure employment, that they don't have a toxic workplace
Mm-hmm.
and psychological injuries when they're moving into employment.
What is your take on? Because I agree that yes, I think we definitely do need to um empower women in the sense that there's other careers that are you could argue traditionally, like you said, more masculine driven. Um, what is your take on empowering men as well? Because I feel that men are committing suicide at record high rates, much more than any other group of people.
Yeah,
Men have increasing levels of depression.
yeah,
And I think it's due to a lot of things, and I think men are underperforming in elementary schools.
yeah,
It's kind of it's a system that's not really catered to, again, like we talked, the innate psychological differences between men and women. What is your take on that? Because let's say, and I've worked, I've done I've worked in manual labor, for an earlier part of my life, and it is a rough environment in many ways,
mm-hmm.
right? Men, we tend to be a lot rougher with each other than we would with a lady, right? Not just in the way we speak, but in the way we just treat each other very
Yeah,
differently. We're not as
yeah,
empathetic to one another, right?
yeah,
um and I think that there is definitely room for balance in that, in terms of like the way we treat each other. I think sometimes men can be quite ruthless, but nevertheless, I think there is definitely a deep psychological impact in young men today.
yeah,
And that's not to say that it's either one of the other. And that's kind of part of the narrative that you hear a lot on the media or in social media, which is like, it's either you're pro men but you're against women, or you're pro women but you're against men. And that's obviously
yeah.
not the case, right?
No,
Where do you stand on that debate ground?
I agree. It's funny you ask that because we've just started conversations with a UK-based partner about running like an empowering men or a men's circle, because what we recognise, and I think as society, people forget that we can't just point the finger at men and say, well, it's all their fault, and domestic and family violence is rising. It's all their fault, which we know men are the perpetrators most of the time. But I keep saying to my team, we're not getting to the root cause. Why are we not looking at early intervention with young boys and young men in elementary school? And we're talking to them about how they healthily show emotion and how to deal with their feelings. And boys can cry, men can cry. Making it okay, not this. I guess, I go back to sort of my dad and my husband, both Europeans, that were brought up in very tough European households, like boys don't cry and men don't show emotion and, get on with it and all of those things. Like, you can't be depressed. If you're depressed, too bad. You have to, soldier on. And I wonder if it's some of those historical approaches to schooling, parenting, education, and how I guess society have viewed men in the past that have made generations of young boys and men bottle up their emotions and their feelings, unlike women who usually find their little tribe of women and we can have a cry and we can vent and we can rant and rave and we typically feel safe doing that. But I think society's still not quite there in giving men the permission to do the exact same thing and still be seen as masculine. It's like women thinking they need to be very masculine and stoic as leaders, when really, why can't women be feminine and still be respected as leaders? So I think there's work to do on both sides. I think men and women equally, they need to be empowered. They need to be empowered to show up as their authentic selves, and women are kind of have those days when they're not coping and they need to ask for help. But how do we create a society and communities and education systems where both men, women, young girls, young men feel comfortable and psychologically safe to say, I'm not doing okay, I need help, and for men to speak up when they're feeling depressed or they're struggling or they're not coping at work and coming home and feeling comfortable with their family saying, I think I need help, rather than suicide.
Yeah, and that's something that I'm seeing in, that's very popular, I would say. That there's a lot of men that they suffer in silence.
Yeah.
And whether it's against, like you mentioned, society that has, kind of molded them in a certain way, or also, I mean, the lack, I guess maybe some of that may come from the loss of meaning, right?
Mm.
What is your take on that? It's really strange now if you ask the average person, especially like in America, it's also a big issue where if you ask the average American person, what does it mean to be American? What does it
Mm.
mean to be part of a greater purpose? Right. And before it was God, right? Because people had religion to give them a sense of a greater purpose. But, as we're moving away from that, I guess we're kind of losing that sense of awe of the universe and that sense of purpose. Um, what's the solution to that, you think? I mean, obviously, there's no easy answer to that, right? I mean, philosophers have been trying to solve it for years, but in a society where we are getting more and more disconnected from ourselves, men disconnected from themselves, women disconnected from themselves, what makes us who we are, what makes humans who they are. And we have this like existential vacuum almost, right? Where we don't know why we're here. What's the solution to that, you think?
Well, for me, when I thought I knew my purpose, but I was feeling empty and not motivated, which I hate because that's not me, but not excited to go to work every day. And I mean, nobody's going to jump out of bed excited to go to work every day, but most days, why can't you? So for me, it was sitting down and being really honest with myself and this was, I guess, the catalyst for starting Elevated almost 3 years ago, was sitting down and being really honest with myself, and thinking, what parts of my life and my career, because workplace takes up so much of our life and our time, really fills my cup, really gives me butterflies in my stomach, or at the end of a particular day in my career or days, when was I, up here with energy and elated? What were those things that drove those feelings, right? And I identified really quickly what they were. And then I did a lot of work, a lot of reflection, and a lot of internal work where I looked at what I thought were my core values and sat down and again was really honest with myself and identified that my three top core values were not what I thought they were. My core values are freedom. Number one, that came out very strong on top. Second one was connection, and the third one was purpose. And so what that made me realize was that I needed the freedom in my work to feel those things again, to create things and opportunities where I could feel like my purpose cup had been fulfilled. I think that gaining that clarity for people around their why and their purpose is incredibly important, because people, like you said, are losing absolute connection. We're so distracted these days by social media and scrolling, and just we've got so many choices. Even just sitting down and putting the TV on at night, it takes 20 minutes to decide on what we're going to watch. Unlike when I was a young kid, it was 3 channels and that's it. You don't have choice. But people back then, I think, were much happier. They had different challenges, but they were happier. And so I think that's part of it, is gaining that clarity about what are you passionate about? And for me, I had to sit there and think, when I'm not here anymore, and I'm a mum, I've got a daughter, what do I want to be remembered for? Essentially, what do I want when none of us are going to be here forever? In 100 years, none of us are going to be here, right? So having a big house and a fancy car doesn't matter, because some other family will be living in it, or it'll be torn down, or whatever. What do you want to be remembered for? And I know it sounds a little bit morbid, but I had to think about, what legacy do I want to leave behind for my daughter, maybe her kids, and what do I want, people to remember me for? And what do I want to spend the rest of my life doing when it comes to work? And that's how I figured out what my purpose was, and that was what informed what we offer at Elevated.
And I don't think it's morbid at all that you thought about your legacy, because, I mean, again, going back to our conversation a little bit earlier in terms of the duality of life, right? For you to really get an understanding of what life is, you have to be willing to accept the fact that death is a part of life.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's magnificent, and I think that what you've done and what you're continuing to do is what we need more in the world. We need more people that are saying, "Hey, I need to get involved in this problem that I see, and I need to do my best and put myself out there." And I think you're doing that.
Mm-hmm.
So, Kylie, as we're coming up on time here, firstly, I want to thank you again for joining us again. And the first discussion we had was more spiritual on that side, and today was more on psychological and business side of what you do, which I think I had a lot of fun, and I always learn a lot from you, which is why I wanted to have you back. So before we close off today, Kylie, what is one thing that you would like our audience to take away from this conversation?
Life is short. That's the theme here, right? Life is short. None of us are here forever. Make your time on this planet matter. Whatever that means to you, just make it matter. Social media posts and what people think of you and all the rest of it, that stuff doesn't matter. But the happiness and the work you do, and I guess the impact you have on the lives of others, that's the stuff that truly matters. So that's what I would say.
Most definitely. Kylie, thank you so much for your time, for your expertise, for this wonderful conversation. And to our listeners, if you've made it this far, thank you so much. We're going to be linking to Kylie's website and to her social media channels in this video as well. So thank you all very much for listening. Make sure to subscribe, to like us, to share us. This obviously supports us and helps us do this a lot more. So again, Kylie, thank you so much for your time. This has been wonderful.
Thank you. So great to be here.
Thank you. Bye-bye.